And yet another major global central bank has dropped its rates again, and though it doesn't want to, has said it will slash them further even as it gets closer and closer to historically low territory. They all start out thinking the same thing, that trade wars are going to be inflationary, only to find out in a matter of weeks, as it turns out, they're not. Instead, rates are following the economy lower and lower and lower. Not only are they seeing this, all of them now are acting on it. South Korea was in trouble already, long before tariffs, having experienced essentially an economic freeze lasting a full year. And that freeze set annual GDP for Q1 into the minuses for the first time since 2009. So of course the Bank of Korea was going to be cutting rates. However, officials didn't cut rates last month because, like the Fed, they did want to see how this tariff business might play out in terms of consumer prices. They wanted some confirmation. Would higher trade prices lead to inflationary pressures? And it did not take long for them to get their answer. It has been definitive. Are you kidding me? Like other central banks we've been covering of late, all of them were wondering if trade wars might spark supply chain problems and then create the conditions for maybe a mini 2021 supply shock. But again, in no time flat, they find out that economies are getting weaker and weaker. South Korea is simply the latest to demonstrate how pre-existing macro and financial problems compounded by a trade shock is just a bad place to be. Therefore, lower rates all around, markets, then eventually central bank policies. From South Korea to Mexico, the Mexicans just did their third 50 in a row. They're all lowering rates, ditching inflation narratives, and furiously slashing economic projections. And with what the U.S. government just reported for U.S. GDP revisions, there's every reason for these central bankers to be really nervous about the months ahead. The Fed really is the only one that's sitting there left pretending that trade wars are somehow going to be inflationary. One by one, all these other central banks that would normally agree with the Fed have had reality thrown in their face. And as their economies and their growth rates get weaker and weaker and lower, their interest rate policies follow because, like gravity, that's where the entire global system was heading to begin with. But in South Korea, what happened was earlier today, the Bank of South Korea lowered its 7-day repo rate to 2.5%, getting closer and closer to historically low territory that we heard just a year ago was never going to happen again. Now, the Bank of South Korea started at 3.5% last year. Their first rate cut showed up in October. Then there was another one in November. And already you could tell something was wrong because that was the first back-to-back meetings that the Bank of Korea had cut since 2009. And the economic circumstances that went along with them perfectly fitting for all of this. And obviously the rate cuts didn't work. They never do. Despite the events that happened in December, the political turmoil, the failed coup, the failed martial law, all of that stuff, despite the fact that everything was looking downward in the first quarter, BOK held in April because of Jay Powell's form of uncertainty. That's what they kept saying, uncertainty. All these central bankers keep thinking, well, this has to be inflationary because prices might go up, and we believe in expectations theory, even though you really shouldn't. There's no evidence for it. Prices go up, maybe that becomes something like 2021. Bank of Korea, like so many other central banks, including the Fed, they started out with this uncertainty, so they held policy in April, but then just a couple weeks later said, holy crap, we better get going again. What we got from the Bank of Korea was not just a rate cut, not just restarted rate cuts, but also indications there are indeed more to come. As ChosunBiz reported, of the 6 commissioners, excluding the governor, 4 of them agreed that the possibility of lowering the base rate below 2.5% within 3 months from now should be considered. The governor noted that, quote, 4 members believe it would be appropriate to stimulate the economy, not that rate cuts stimulate, through additional rate cuts as the economy has worsened more than expected. There's the thing. They were waiting for inflation to see if there was inflation pressures and found instead there are no inflation pressures. There are only downside weakness as the economy has worsened more than expected. And then adds, the remaining 2 members suggested it would be better to decide on rate cuts while assessing the effects of the base interest rate reduction. In other words, whether or not there was more support from more rate cuts from the BOK, changes in U.S. tariff policies, fluctuations in metropolitan real estate prices, and new government economic policies. Not enough weakness for 2 members, but more than enough for 4 members because it weakened a lot more than they were expecting, and they were already expecting it to be weak because Korea's been in bad shape, as I said, for an entire year already. It's actually been in bad shape for several years, but it's gotten much, much worse. Forgot how to grow, remembered to do worse last year at the global inflection in March and April, at least for South Korea. Now, before we get back to the rest of today's video, I want to tell you about today's video sponsor. We talk all the time on this channel about the dangers the world is facing, trying to come to grips with the aftermath of the pandemic and the lockdowns, the difficulties associated with the supply shock and price illusion, not to mention still living in the shadow of the 2008 crisis. To put it mildly, there's a lot of systemic uncertainty. Now, I've recommended gold as a store of value hedge for years. In fact, it's the ultimate error hedge. While gold prices are at an all-time high, price appreciation isn't the only way to profit. You can earn a yield on gold paid in gold without selling your metal. When the price of gold increases, so does the cost to store it and insure it. Don't lose money owning gold, earn a yield on it instead. And Monetary Metals allows you to earn up to 4% on your metal in their gold leasing program. And you start earning that 4% yield immediately upon funding your account. The yield you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold or silver, which you get in addition to any price appreciation from gold and silver during the year. So join the thousands of investors earning interest in physical gold and silver every month with Monetary Metals. There's a link in the description of this video that has all the information that you need. We thank Monetary Metals for their sponsorship, and now back to the rest of this video. And as Governor Rhee himself added at his press conference, since growth momentum has weakened more significantly than initially expected. Remember, they initially expected this stuff. I talked about this last month. They were expecting initial weakness just a month ago. So when I say it was a matter of weeks to go from let's pause for this uncertainty and see how it goes to, oh, we better get started with rate cuts and also consider doing more, even though we're getting close to 2%, and we don't want to go below 2%. They don't want to go below 2.5%, but they already see the weakness, the writing on the wall there. That's almost not quite a done deal. Nothing ever is. But as far as in the terms of economics and central banking, this is about as close to a done deal as you can get. So as Rhee said, as he continued, we believe there's a possibility rates will be cut more than we thought going forward. Like I said, they don't want to go lower, but events are forcing them to go lower, which is what we've been saying all along. Rate cuts are not stimulus. They're a reaction to economic weakness of whatever type and whatever case. And as they're a reaction to economic weakness, the weakness gets started, it doesn't stop. So what happens to interest rates? They go down some more, and then they go down some more and more and more. You get into a series of rate cuts like Pringles. Once you pop, you just can't stop because it's the weakness that's driving everything. And central banks like markets are kind of just along for the ride. So going from pause in April, let's see what happens to inflation, to we're going to cut again, and then probably a lot more ahead of us in just a matter of a couple weeks. And as CNBC reported from the Bank of Korea meeting, the BOK Monetary Policy Board attributed the rate cut decision to its expectations that economic growth will, and here's the key words, the key term, decline considerably while inflation remains broadly stable, according to the statement put out by the BOK. Quote, the board will maintain its rate cut stance to mitigate downside risk to economic growth and adjust the timing and pace of any further base rate cuts while closely monitoring changes in domestic and external policy environment, which translation, like I said, we worried about inflation. Now we see that there's no inflation anywhere. It's really just about economic weakness that is developing more quickly and more intensely than we were expecting. And so we expect considerably worse than we did just a couple months ago or just last month. Accompanying the rate cut was a slashing of growth projections. The Bank of Korea's official forecast for 2025 GDP is now just 0.8%, down from 1.5% at its last projections back a couple months ago. And as I pointed out repeatedly, annual GDP rates that are below about 1.5%, not just in the United States, but everywhere, annual GDP rates that get below 1.5%, there's almost guaranteed to be a recession in that calendar year. And here the Bank of Korea is saying, well, we were at the 1.5% threshold, and then things deteriorated more quickly, more intensely than we expected. So now we're at 0.8%. The way to read that is essentially the Bank of Korea is saying the chances of a recession in 2025 have gone up substantially. Therefore, one reason why they're saying forget inflation, forget all that uncertainty, let's focus on this downside. Now, while they think rate cuts might help, we know that's just a reaction. So they're confirming the downside case, not just as some theoretical thing, but they're seeing it in South Korea already as a response to global economic conditions, and they're already acting on it. That's the other important point too. Now, one big reason why central bankers are starting to get a little more nervous and even panicky, like here in South Korea, is what was reported in U.S. GDP revisions for the first quarter. If you remember, GDP was dismissed because it was negative. It was minus 0.3% at the preliminary estimation. Everybody said, well, that's just imports. They were upsetting the balance of the GDP. Record negative contribution from imports, so we can set all of that aside. And everyone pointed to consumption, personal consumption expenditures, consumer spending seemed to be relatively solid. At least that's what they said. The preliminary estimates for PCE, or personal consumption expenditures, was just 1.8%. Like I said, they said that's solid. It sounds better than certainly a small negative, but 1.8% was already relatively weak. And we've talked about this numerous times before. Jay Powell says the problem in the U.S. economy is that consumer sentiment is apocalyptically negative. It's gotten a little bit better here in May after the trade delays, but not all that much. So consumer sentiment is way down, but we don't see any evidence that it's anything more than consumer sentiment. Au contraire, mon frere. We see that, in fact, consumer spending was weak in the first quarter before we even got to the tariffs and trade stuff and the drop in the stock market that happened in April. So personal consumption expenditures were negative in January, very substantially negative in January, failed to rebound in February, and then there was a splurge in March, mainly attributable to front-running tariffs to buy automobiles. So consumer spending was actually weak in the first quarter, and these revisions to GDP show that it was even weaker than initially thought. So where the Bureau of Economic Analysis put personal consumption expenditures at 1.8% quarter over quarter annual rate in the first quarter, they now say it was just 1.18%, which is shaving off of a third of the growth rate. That's the weakest rate for PCE since the bank crisis quarter in 2023. And remember, it was only saved in March by tariff front running. But with that weaker consumer spending, GDP was actually increased from minus 0.3% to minus 0.2% in a combination because government spending wasn't as bad as thought. It wasn't actually negative, it was slightly positive. But also there was an offset in inventories, which leads to the worst possible case if you're a central banker in a place like South Korea or Mexico, as we'll see in just a second. So what GDP did actually was lower the amount of goods and services that were actually bought in the first quarter by a pretty substantial amount and put a lot of those goods into inventories. Less consumer spending, more in inventories. Less consumer spending, more in inventories is not a good place to be for the entire global supply chain, especially those from around the rest of the world. Because more inventory and less sales already leaves a hell of a lot more of that stuff to be sold across the months ahead, which means that all of the wholesalers and importers in the U.S. are working the phones and the fax machines, and an homage to Steve here, they're working their fax machines telling producers, stop sending us stuff. We've got way too much already. In fact, with the revisions, the increase in inventories and GDP in the first quarter was enormous, by far the most since the first quarter of 2022, back when the supply chain was just starting to be fixed. We had an enormous increase in inventories that isn't getting sold at the rate, certainly of the rate the first quarter spending, which means we don't need more production. So that's going to be a big problem for producers outside the U.S. as well as producers inside the U.S. as well as a whole bunch of service providers, because so many services are related to the transportation, the storing, and the selling of all these goods, which are not being sold or being stored. So for South Korea, especially with auto exports, they're saying, we've got an air pocket just ahead of us. When the Bank of South Korea officials are saying, the situation deteriorated more than they expected, this is why. What we're seeing why in U.S. GDP. So as much as there's been an effect in Korea, South Korea, there's an even bigger effect looming in Mexico, because just like South Korea, the Mexican economy didn't just hit a trouble spot here in 2025. It has been building for the last year just alongside with South Korea because it's globally synchronized. In response to that weakness, Banxico, as the central bank is known, they have already been cutting rates since last March. And like every other central bank around the world too, they started out intending to go slow. In fact, Banxico was the second central bank to go after the Swiss National Bank got it all started. So what Banxico intended was nothing more than a one rate cut to see how inflation developed in Mexico, maybe another rate cut toward the end of last year, but to go slow, certainly not every meeting. That only lasted until August. So while they paused after March, beginning last August, they started cutting every meeting, 4 straight 25 basis point rate cuts. And then after that, they accelerated as the weakness did long before tariffs during the artificial high, which was supporting a lot of the Mexican economy at the time. Even during it, Banxico started cutting by 50 basis point increments. In fact, they've done 3 of those up to and including the last meeting. And despite all that, their economic projections, like those in South Korea or Europe or Australia and New Zealand, as I talked about yesterday, they're slashing their economic projections because they're no longer worried about inflation. They're instead worried about the downside. It isn't just a risk, it's already emerging. You gotta love Bloomberg's sub-headline here. Banxico sees growth of 0.1% this year, ruling out recession. That doesn't rule out recession. As I just said with South Korea, an annual rate less than 1.5% has a very high chance of a recession in that calendar year. 0.1% means almost guaranteed to have a recession. So they're ruling out recession in Mexico? Bull. But with the article, it says, Mexico's central bank cut its growth forecast for this year and that's the other part, next year too, amid mounting signs that Latin America's second biggest economy is stalling. It's doing much worse than that. However, the bank doesn't expect a recession because this is all about semantics. Banxico, as the bank is known, cut its 2025 gross domestic product growth forecast to just 0.1%. Why didn't they just cut? They could have said minus 0.1% and it would have made any difference except for the wording, the phrasing, and the headlines. So it cut its growth forecast to 0.1% in its central scenario from just 0.6% previously, according to its quarterly inflation report. The bank sees the economy growing at 0.9% next year, half of the rate of 1.8% from February's report. And so here comes the official commentary telling you this is no big deal. We are forecasting a period of sluggishness for economic activity, but not a recession, according to Governor Victoria Rodriguez. Rodriguez's deputy governor also added in the presentation that the bank expects, quote, a stagnant economy with a downward balance of risks. So they don't want to say it's a recession, but the recession is right there in front of them, and they've been forgot how to growing for quite some time already. So of course, Mexico's interest rates, their official interest rates, are heading lower and heading lower quickly because globally synchronized. It's not really all that different in Mexico as South Korea, as Japan, as we're talking about with Japan and a technical recession there, as Germany and France, where the labor market seems to have buckled in both of those places and turned lower. Globally synchronized, not inflation, downside risks all over. Jay Powell is the only central bank left saying inflation, inflation, inflation. Even those central banks that would nominally agree with him, at least on the academic side of things and the models for macroeconomic risks, they no longer can agree with him because the reality of the global economy is very different. And we've seen it in one after another here at the end of May, and it's going to continue on into June, where we'll get other central banks like the ECB. They're going to cut down to 2%. Almost certainly the Swiss National Bank, remember, they're already at 0.25%. The 0% is almost certainly a done deal. Again, nothing ever is a done deal. Nothing's 100% guaranteed, but it's as close as possible to the Swiss National Bank, if not seeing negative rates out of the Swiss this coming month as well. The Riksbank in Sweden, they said we're going to stop at 2.25% and see if inflation shows up in Sweden, having already forecast that they were not going to go any lower than 2.25%. And then all of a sudden, over the last several weeks, they say, yeah, we're going to go lower than 2.25%. The ECB, I talked about them yesterday. Now they're not going to stop at 2%. In fact, all the markets like Euribor futures keep showing that ECB has a growing chance of not just sub 2%, but even sub 1% rates as economic weakness develops and gets further and further into labor markets beyond just Germany and France. The Reserve Bank of Australia, I talked about them with Steve. The Reserve Bank of Australia said, like all the other central banks, we're going to go slow. We're going to see what happens with inflation and tariffs, see how all that develops. And instead, they cut for the second straight meeting and also said, you know what? We actually discussed a 50. Now, while they didn't take it seriously, and it probably wasn't a realistic option for RBA, the fact that they were telling the press that, and therefore the rest of the public, that was the important part. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand has been battling against a more recognizable recession over the last year. They thought they had gotten out of it because GDP turned positive in the fourth quarter, which really doesn't mean as much as they think it does, especially when you look at the pattern of New Zealand GDP over the last several years of forgot how to grow economy. But either way, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, up until recently, said, we'd like to hold here. We don't think we need to go any lower. Oh, crap, we actually do. So the Reserve Bank of New Zealand actually cut again, despite the fact they don't want to, and then said we're probably going to have to cut more up ahead. And so you can see all over the world, outside of the Federal Reserve, all these central banks are, while we would worry about inflation if we could, we actually can't. And so one by one, they confirm no inflation, rates going down. And rates going down, having gone down already a lot farther than most people appreciate. They're doing exactly what the markets said they were going to do from a couple years ago. Remember what the markets were saying? Everyone around the media, everyone around central banks said higher for longer, inflation risks are permanent, we need to keep rates up. The markets said no, 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 no. Rates are going to go down over time. They're going to go down a lot more than people think, and then they're going to stay there. So in the context of all that, everything that's happening up to and including the tariff shock potentially is consistent with that path. Central banks that did not want to cut rates at all are now cutting rates in a way that is exactly consistent with how the markets laid out this entire time. Unemployment rising more than expected in Germany in the month of May, with jobs and payrolls in France turning lower, plus the Reserve Bank of New Zealand saying we got to cut rates. That was all in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.